What's the most extreme thing your father made you wear? My dad laced me into a steel corset and tightened it until I couldn't breathe, because he said our family's women had 18-inch waists for 5 generations, and I wouldn't be the one to break tradition. It was my 8th birthday. Instead of cake and presents, Dad led me to his study where Mom stood in the corner, her own waist cinched so tight she looked like someone had folded her in half. "Time to start your training," he said. The steel bones bit into my ribs as he yanked the laces. I tried to scream but couldn't get enough air. "Beauty requires sacrifice," he said, nodding it so tight my vision went spotty. That first day I puked twice from the pressure. My stomach was squished to nothing, like someone had stepped on a juice box. Dad gave me protein shakes to sip through straws, maybe 4 ounces at a time. Regular breathing was impossible, so I had to pant like a dog in summer heat. My ribs felt like someone was slowly pushing them through my lungs. Mom watched from her chair, hands folded over her own crushed middle, cinched down to the size of a 2-liter soda bottle. My sisters Violetta and Helen had been training for years. Violetta's waist at 14 was smaller than my leg. Helen's at 16 wasn't much bigger. They moved like broken robots, couldn't bend over to tie their shoes or twist to look behind them. During dinner, they'd sit super straight, faces gray from no oxygen, eating maybe 3 bites while Dad measured their waists between courses. "Violetta, you've expanded a 1/4 inch. No food tomorrow." Other kids at school played tag while I leaned on walls trying not to pass out. Gym class? Forget it. Dad got me excused with fake medical notes. The real medical issue was my liver getting shoved up into my rib cage. The nurse found me unconscious in the bathroom once and wanted to call 911, but Dad showed up and convinced her I just had anxiety. Yeah, anxiety about my organs getting rearranged like furniture. By 10, Dad decided I needed serious training corset. This device had twice the steel bones and was shaped to basically fold me in half. He'd hang me from this pull-up bar to stretch my spine while he yanked the laces. I'd black out every time, but he'd splash water on my face to wake me up. "Your great-grandmother achieved 16 inches by your age," he'd say. 16 inches. I could fit both my hands around that with fingers overlapping. The damage showed up fast. I couldn't digest anything because my stomach was crushed flat. My period stopped at 11. My spine curved into an S shape from the pressure. My ribs started overlapping in front, poking through my skin like I was turning inside out. When I told Mom about the stabbing pains, she just stared at me with dead eyes and whispered, "It never stops hurting. 20 years, and it never stops." But she didn't help me. All she said was that if I stopped my training, I'd never be beautiful. And I was so brainwashed I thought that was all that mattered. Violetta's body gave up first. At 18, her liver quit from being squeezed for 10 years. The doctor said her organs looked like they'd been in a car accident. Dad called the doctor an idiot and took Violetta home. Made her keep wearing the corset while she turned yellow and coughed blood. "Your wedding is in 3 months, he kept saying. "Your husband expects perfection." That's when I realized this wasn't worth dying for. I tried to cut my corset off with kitchen shears, but the steel was too thick. Dad caught me and went ballistic. He got a new corset, tighter than before, with actual locks on it like I was a prisoner. He wore the keys on a chain around his neck. Then Helen's rib exploded during a tightening session. It sounded like stepping on a bag of chips. She dropped and started making these wet breathing sounds because the bone had punched into her lung. Dad kept pulling the laces while she was literally drowning in her own blood. "It'll heal in place," he said, like ribs were meant to be inside your lungs. Mom finally called 911 when Helen's lips went blue, but Dad made her lie about it being a fall. When Helen was still in the hospital, Dad called a family meeting. Violetta was basically dying on the couch, and Mom was crying silently in her chair. Dad pulled out this ancient corset made of ivory and silk. 12 inches, he said, holding it up like the Holy Grail. "Your great-great-grandmother wore this for 50 years. It was barely bigger around than a baseball. You could fit it in one hand." He turned to me with that torture device, and I knew he was going to try to achieve his sick dream through my body. 5 generations of women crushed into impossible shapes, and I was the last chance. He approached with that ivory nightmare, talking about honor and legacy. "Violetta is dying, and Helen is broken," he said, like it was their fault. "But you can still be perfect." Dad held up that antique torture device, smaller than my neck, and smiled at me like he was giving me a gift instead of a death sentence. Dad took a step toward me, holding that ivory corset in both hands like it was some kind of prize. His eyes were bright and excited in a way that made my stomach twist even worse than the steel already crushing it. The corset looked impossible, way smaller than anything a person could actually wear and still breathe. I could see Violetta on the couch behind Dad, her skin yellow and her breathing shallow, literally dying from what he'd done to her body for 10 years. Helen was in the hospital with a rib through her lung, and he wanted to do something even worse to me. My vision got narrow and focused on just that tiny circle of silk and bone, and I knew with total clarity that if he got that thing on me, I would die. Not eventually, not in a few years, but soon, maybe in days or weeks. My body couldn't take being crushed down to 12 inches. I needed to do something right now, or I'd end up like my sisters. I made a fast decision that staying alive mattered more than being obedient. I blurted out that I needed the bathroom immediately, or I'd have an accident right there on the floor. My voice came out high and panicky, but that probably helped sell it. Dad's face twisted up with disgust, because he hated when anyone mentioned normal body stuff. He waved his hand at me like he was shooing away a fly and told me I had 2 minutes before we continued my training. 2 minutes. That was all the time I had to figure out how to save myself. I moved as fast as I could toward the bathroom, my ribs screaming with each step because the current corset was already so tight I could barely get air. In the bathroom, I locked the door with hands that shook so bad I almost couldn't turn the little button. I stared at my reflection in the mirror and saw my own gray face staring back. But I also saw Violetta's yellow skin and Helen's blue lips, like they were superimposed over my features, showing me exactly what my future looked like. The memory of Helen's rib crunching played in my head on repeat, that wet cracking sound like stepping on a bag of chips. She'd dropped to the floor making these horrible breathing noises because the bone had punctured straight into her lung. Dad had kept pulling the laces anyway, and Violetta was dying right now in the other room, while he talked about putting me in something even worse. My sisters' destroyed bodies were showing me my own future unless I did something right this second. I couldn't wait or hope things would get better. I needed to act now. I grabbed the cheap disposable razor from the shower and carefully slid it up my sleeve where it would stay hidden. Then I tucked my phone into my waistband, where the bulky sweatshirt covered the outline. My hands were steadier than I expected as I planned out what came next. I needed to make this abuse visible to someone who had the power to stop it. I needed witnesses. I needed evidence. The phone and razor were my tools for creating that. When I came back to the study, Dad immediately started the tightening process with the current corset. He yanked the laces so hard that black spots swam across my vision and I couldn't get enough air to scream. My ribs compressed inward and I felt them shifting in ways ribs shouldn't shift. I focused on keeping the razor and phone hidden while I scanned the room for anything else that could serve as evidence later. There were the old journals on the shelf that documented generations of this sick tradition. There was the ivory corset sitting on Dad's desk. There was Violetta dying on the couch. Everything in this room was evidence of what he'd done to us. Mom sat in her chair by the window, with her own waist crushed down to nothing. Her hands were folded over her middle, and she watched with those dead eyes that hadn't shown real emotion in years. She'd been doing this for 20 years, and it had killed something inside her. Her vacant face told me everything I needed to know about whether help would come from inside this house. She wasn't going to save me. She wasn't going to save any of us. I stopped looking at her for rescue I'd never get. During a brief moment when Dad turned to grab more lacing material from his desk, I angled my phone carefully and pressed the record button. The phone stayed hidden in my waistband, but the microphone was active now, capturing everything. Dad launched into his familiar speech about how beauty requires sacrifice and how our family's women have always understood their duty to maintain the legacy. He talked about the 12-inch standard and how I was the last hope for achieving it since Violetta was dying and Helen was broken. His voice was calm and certain, like he genuinely believed crushing his daughters into impossible shapes was something noble. The recording captured every word about tradition and perfection and the ivory corset that would make me the ultimate achievement of 5 generations. I kept my face blank and my breathing as steady as possible while the phone documented his abuse in his own words. The pressure in my ribs became unbearable, and I leaned over to vomit into the trash can beside the desk. My stomach was crushed too flat to hold anything, so only bile came up, burning my throat. Dad actually smiled when he saw me throw up. He said this was progress, that my body was learning to need less space. The casual way he framed my suffering as some kind of achievement made rage burn through the panic. He was proud of making me vomit. He thought destroying my body was a good thing. As Dad continued tightening the laces, I realized something important. If I couldn't stop what was happening right now in this moment, I could at least make sure it got reported at the school tomorrow. Teachers were mandatory reporters. If I collapsed somewhere public where witnesses could see the locked corset I couldn't remove myself, someone would have to call for help. The school nurse had already found me unconscious once. If it happened again with visible proof of what Dad was doing, she'd have to report it. I needed to collapse somewhere with lots of people around who would see and call 911. Somewhere with witnesses who couldn't be talked out of helping like Mom had been. Somewhere Dad couldn't control the situation. My heart dropped into my crushed stomach when Dad announced that I'd be staying home from the school tomorrow, so he could monitor my adjustment to the more extreme training. He was cutting off my access to outside witnesses before I could use them. He was going to isolate me completely, so nobody could see what he was doing. I needed to force a public crisis before he could lock me in this house. That meant I had to act tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest. I couldn't wait for school. I needed witnesses now. After Dad finally finished and left me crumpled on the study floor, I stayed there for maybe 20 minutes just trying to get enough air into my crushed lungs. The steel bit into my ribs with every shallow breath. My vision kept going gray at the edges from lack of oxygen. When I could finally move without blacking out, I crawled to my bedroom and waited until I heard Dad's office door close downstairs and Mom's footsteps heading to the kitchen. The house settled into its usual quiet, that awful silence where everyone pretends everything is normal. I pulled the razor from where I'd hidden it up my sleeve and tucked it under my mattress where Dad wouldn't find it during his random room checks. My phone showed 67% battery, so I plugged it in to charge overnight. The audio recording was still saved in my files, Dad's voice talking about sacrifice and the 12-inch corset and how I was the last hope for the family legacy. Tomorrow, I needed to make this visible. Tomorrow, I needed witnesses who couldn't be talked out of helping. The grocery store plan formed in my head as I lay there staring at the ceiling. Lots of people, security cameras, public space where Dad couldn't control what happened. If I collapsed there with the locked corset visible, someone would call 911 before Dad could stop them. Mom always did the shopping on Saturday afternoons when the store was busiest. I just needed to convince her to take me along. The next afternoon, I found Mom in the kitchen, measuring out protein powder for my next shake. My stomach was too crushed to hold real food anymore, so these shakes were basically my only nutrition. I made my voice sound casual when I told her we were almost out of the powder and Dad would be angry if we ran out. She looked at me with those dead eyes for a long moment, before nodding slowly. We needed groceries anyway. The drive to the store took 15 minutes, and I spent the whole time checking that my phone was in my pocket with the recording still saved. Mom parked near the entrance and grabbed a cart. Inside the store was packed with Saturday shoppers, families with kids, couples doing their weekly shopping, exactly what I needed. We moved through the aisles slowly because I couldn't walk fast with the corset crushing my middle. The cereal aisle had the most people in it. Plus, I could see 2 security cameras mounted on the ceiling. Mom was reading a label on a box of granola when I stopped fighting. I just let my body do what it had been trying to do for hours, which was shut down from lack of oxygen. My legs went out from under me, and I dropped straight to the floor. The impact knocked what little air I had out of my lungs. I lay there on the cold tile gasping like a fish out of water, my mouth opening and closing, but not getting enough air to actually breathe. My shirt had ridden up when I fell, and the locked steel corset was completely visible, the padlock hanging off the front like some kind of sick jewelry. People crowded around immediately, their voices loud and worried over my head. Someone asked if I was okay. Someone else said to give me space. A woman in yoga pants pulled out her phone, and I heard her talking to 911, describing a teenage girl who collapsed and couldn't breathe. She mentioned the metal device around my waist. Another person asked Mom what was wrong with me. Why was I wearing that thing? Mom's voice came out shaky as she tried to explain that it was a back brace for my spine, just a medical device, nothing to worry about. But I could hear the panic underneath her words, because this was exactly what Dad had warned her about, people seeing and asking questions. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes according to the store's security footage that got pulled later. 2 of them, a man and a woman, both moving fast with their equipment bags. The woman knelt beside me and started checking my vital signs, while the man cleared people back to give them room to work. Her hands were gentle when she touched my neck to check my pulse. She asked me my name and if I could tell her what happened. I managed to whisper that I couldn't breathe right, that the corset was too tight. The male paramedic's eyes went to the padlock, and his face changed. He asked Mom directly why her daughter was wearing a locked medical restraint, and who had the key. Mom tried to stick to the back brace story, but her voice was shaking worse now. The female paramedic was looking at where the steel pressed into my skin, at the blue tinge around my lips, at how my chest could barely move when I tried to inhale. She told her partner they needed to transport immediately. Mom started protesting that it wasn't necessary, that I just needed to rest, that we could take me home. The male paramedic cut her off and said clearly that they were making the medical decision to transport based on my restricted breathing and the concerning device. They got me onto a stretcher and started wheeling me toward the ambulance. That's when Dad appeared out of nowhere, his car screeching into the parking lot like he'd been monitoring Mom's phone or something. He tried to follow us into the ambulance, but the lead paramedic, the woman, blocked him with her body and told him firmly that he could follow in his own car, but he wasn't riding with us. It was the first time I'd ever seen anyone set a boundary with Dad and make it stick. His face went red with rage, but the paramedic didn't back down. She climbed into the ambulance with me, and her partner closed the doors. As we pulled away, I could see Dad standing in the parking lot with Mom, both of them getting smaller in the window. The ER at County Hospital was bright and cold and smelled like cleaning chemicals. They wheeled me into a room, and a doctor came in almost immediately. His name tag said, Dr. Mohammed Ramirez. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of calm face that made you think he'd seen everything. But when he examined the corset and saw how tight it was, how the steel was digging into my skin, how shallow my breathing was, his expression went carefully blank. That professional mask doctors use when they're seeing something really wrong but don't want to scare you. He asked me questions in a quiet voice, just him and me with the door closed. Did I feel safe at home? Was anyone hurting me? Could I tell him about the device and why it was locked? I was so tired of lying and hiding and pretending everything was fine. The words came out in a whisper, because I didn't have enough air for anything louder. I told him my dad put it on me and wouldn't take it off. I told him my sisters were dying. I told him about Violetta's liver and Helen's lung and the 12-inch corset Dad wanted to use on me next. Dr. Ramirez listened to everything without interrupting, just nodding and making notes on his tablet. When I finished talking, Dr. Ramirez told me he needed to make some phone calls and he'd be right back. He stepped out into the hallway, but left the door cracked, and I could hear him talking to someone about non-accidental injury patterns and mandatory reporting requirements. His voice was calm, but firm, the voice of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen next. Through the crack in the door, I saw Dad appear in the hallway, trying to get to my room. He was talking loud about his rights as a parent and demanding to see me, but hospital security showed up within seconds, two big guys in uniforms who positioned themselves between Dad and my door. They told him he could wait in the family area, but he couldn't interfere with my medical care. Dad's face went purple, but the security guards didn't move, and eventually he had to back off. I could hear him still arguing as they walked him away from my room. The knot of fear in my chest loosened just a tiny bit, because for the first time in my life, someone was stopping him. About an hour later, a woman came into my room and introduced herself as Elise Mendez from Child Protective Services. She had short, dark hair and wore business clothes, a blazer and slacks that looked professional, but not scary. She explained that the hospital had made a mandatory report and she needed to talk with me privately about what was happening at home. She asked if it was okay to record our conversation for documentation, and I said yes. Then I remembered my phone and the recording I'd made of Dad. My hands shook as I pulled it out and found the audio file. I told Elise about how I'd recorded Dad's whole speech about the 12-inch corset and the family legacy, and how I was supposed to be perfect. She listened to the entire recording, her face getting more and more grim as Dad's voice talked about sacrifice and tradition and how Violetta and Helen were failures, but I could still achieve the standard. When it finished playing, Elise was quiet for a moment before she started making detailed notes about everything she'd heard. She asked me questions about Violetta's liver failure and Helen's punctured lung, writing down every answer. Then she said something that made me start crying. She told me that with my permission, Doctor, Ramirez could remove the locked corset using bolt cutters. Just cut it off. I didn't know that was even possible. I'd spent so long thinking I was trapped in it forever that only Dad had the power to remove it. But Elise was saying someone could just cut it off, and I wouldn't have to wait for Dad's permission or convince him or anything. The relief hit me so hard I couldn't stop the tears. The next morning I woke up in a hospital bed with the corset finally gone, and my ribs still aching from where it had crushed them for so long. A different woman came into my room and introduced herself as Kamala Wade from the Victim Advocacy Office. She had warm brown skin and kind eyes, and she sat down next to my bed like she had all the time in the world. She explained her role in helping survivors of abuse with safety planning and court support. She outlined my options in clear, simple terms that didn't talk down to me or make assumptions about what I wanted. Emergency shelter placement where I could stay safe while the investigation happened. Protective orders that would legally require Dad to stay away from me. Court proceedings that would determine where I lived and what happened next. She asked me what I wanted, what felt safest to me, what my biggest fears were about each option. Nobody had ever asked me what I wanted before. Every decision about my body and my life had been made by Dad with Mom silently going along with it. Having someone actually treat me like I had the right to make choices about my own safety felt weird and good and scary all at once. I told Kamala I didn't want to go home. I told her I was afraid Dad would find a way to finish what he started with that 12-inch corset. She nodded like that made perfect sense and started writing down notes about shelter placement and protective orders. Later that day, a detective came to take my statement. His name was Owen Buckley, and he had gray hair and a tired face like he'd been doing this job for a long time. He set up a recording device on the table next to my hospital bed and explained that he needed me to tell him everything that had happened, starting from the beginning. I forced myself to describe the training in factual terms, just the facts of what Dad did and when he did it, and what the results were. I started with my 8th birthday when Dad first put me in the steel corset. I described the progression over 10 years, how the corsets got tighter and more extreme, how my body started breaking down from the pressure. I told him about the medical damage to all 3 of us sisters, about Violetta's failing liver, and Helen's punctured lung, and my own crushed organs and curved spine. I explained about the 12-inch ivory corset and Dad's stated intention to achieve that standard through my body, no matter what it took. Detective Buckley listened to everything and asked clarifying questions about dates and specific incidents. He recorded details about the locks Dad put on my current corset, about the keys he wore around his neck, about how he'd isolated me from the school to prevent anyone from seeing what he was doing. The whole statement took almost 2 hours, and by the end, my voice was hoarse from talking. But Detective Buckley told me I'd done really well, that I'd given him exactly what he needed to move forward with the investigation. He said other people would be involved now, that this wasn't just on me anymore to fix or survive. The system was finally paying attention. The hospital scheduled me for a full imaging workup the next morning, and I spent the night in a regular room with monitors beeping every few minutes. A tech wheeled me down to radiology at 6 a.m. and ran x-rays, CT scans, and an MRI that took over an hour because they needed detailed pictures of my chest and spine. Back in my room 2 hours later, Mohammed came in with a tablet showing the scans and pulled up a chair next to my bed. He pointed to the images on the screen and explained what he was seeing in terms I could actually understand. My ribs had overlapped in the front, where they should have stayed separate, creating a compressed cage that was pushing inward on my lungs. My spine had curved into an unnatural S shape from years of pressure, and several of my organs had shifted from their normal positions because there wasn't enough room for them anymore. My liver was sitting higher than it should be, pressed up against my diaphragm. My stomach had basically flattened out, and my intestines were bunched together in ways that explained why I couldn't digest food properly. Mohammed wrote down referrals for 3 different specialists and said I'd need long-term care to address all the damage. A gastroenterologist to work on my digestive issues, a lung doctor to help with my breathing problems, and an orthopedic specialist to figure out what could be done about my spine. He was honest that some of the damage might be permanent, but said we wouldn't know what was reversible until I'd been out of the corset for several months. Elise showed up around noon with a stack of folders and sat down in the chair Mohammed had used earlier. She told me that Helen was still in the hospital on a different floor, and CPS had placed something called a protective hold on her as a minor. That meant Dad couldn't check her out or take her home against medical advice, and the hospital had to keep her until the court said otherwise. Dad had already tried to interfere by calling the hospital's main line repeatedly, demanding to speak with Helen's doctors and threatening to sue if they didn't release her immediately. Each phone call was documented as evidence that he couldn't prioritize his kid's safety over his control. I asked Elise what was happening with Violetta, and she set down her pen with a careful expression. Violetta was 18, so legally she was an adult who could refuse help even if she was dying. An advocate would try to reach out and offer medical care and safe housing, but they couldn't force her to accept it. The limitation made me want to scream because I knew Violetta was getting worse every day at home, but Elise reminded me that I could only control my own choices and not my sister's decisions. It felt wrong to be getting help while Violetta stayed trapped, but I also knew I couldn't save her if I went back. Detective Buckley called Elise's phone while we were talking, and she put him on speaker. He'd contacted my school that morning and spoken with the nurse, a woman named Hallie, who'd been checking on me since freshman year. Hallie filed a supplemental report documenting all the times she'd found me collapsed in the bathroom or leaning against walls in the hallway, barely able to breathe. Her records showed my gray skin tone during routine health checks and the difficulty I had taking full breaths when she listened to my lungs. She'd noted concerns about possible eating disorders or anxiety, but now the pattern made sense as ongoing abuse. Her documentation added more evidence that multiple people had seen signs something was seriously wrong. By my 3rd day in the hospital, Elise brought me paperwork for an emergency protective order and temporary removal from the home. She walked me through what would happen at the hearing, explaining that a judge would review all the evidence and decide where I'd live while the investigation continued. She was very clear that the judge would make decisions based on safety, not on keeping families together just because that's what society thinks should happen. If going home wasn't safe, I wouldn't go home, period. The hearing was scheduled for the next week, and Elise would be there along with Kamala and Detective Buckley to present the case. That afternoon, Dad tried to get into my hospital room again, and this time security didn't just turn him away. They issued a formal trespass warning, telling him that any further attempt to access my room would result in his arrest. The security guard who delivered the warning wrote up a detailed incident report and gave a copy to Detective Buckley, adding another piece of documentation to the growing file about Dad's inability to respect boundaries. I watched through the small window in my door as the guard walked Dad back to the elevators, and Dad's face was red with rage the whole way down the hall. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification 20 minutes later, and I knew it was Dad before I even checked. I saved the message immediately, and then played it on speaker for Elise. Dad's voice came through tight and controlled, the kind of calm that meant he was absolutely furious. He said I was destroying the family legacy that 5 generations of women had built through sacrifice and dedication. He said I'd regret betraying our traditions and turning my back on everything that made our family special. The explicit threat in his tone made my hands shake, but I forwarded the recording to both Detective Buckley and Elise right away. Elise nodded and made notes, saying the voicemail would strengthen the case for a permanent no-contact order. Elise came back to my room later and sat down on the edge of my bed instead of in the chair. She looked at me directly and said something I'd been too afraid to ask about. I would not be going home tonight or any night until the court determined it was safe, which might mean never going back at all. The mix of feelings that hit me was so intense, I couldn't find words. Grief for the family I'd wanted and never had. Relief that I wouldn't have to face Dad and that 12-inch corset. Fear about what came next, and guilt about leaving Mom and my sisters behind. I couldn't speak, so I just nodded while tears ran down my face, and Elise sat there quietly until I was done crying. Late that night, my phone rang with Mom's number, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mom's voice came through as a whisper, like she was hiding in a closet or bathroom to make the call. She said she knew what Dad did was wrong, and she was sorry she hadn't protected us. She said she didn't know how to leave or how to survive on her own after 20 years of being controlled. I told her I loved her, but I couldn't come back, that I'd die if I went home, and she had to know that was true. I said she needed to choose between protecting her daughters and staying with Dad because she couldn't do both anymore. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought she'd hung up, but then she whispered, "Okay," and the call ended. The next morning, Kamala showed up with coffee and a folder full of papers about court procedures. She explained the layout of the courtroom and who would be present at the hearing, walking me through exactly what would happen from the moment I arrived until the judge made a decision. We practiced breathing exercises I could use if I started panicking, and I was amazed at how much air my lungs could actually hold when they weren't being crushed down to nothing. Kamala had me take slow breaths in through my nose and out through my mouth, counting to 4 each time, and my chest expanded further than it had in 10 years. The simple act of breathing fully felt like a miracle, and a reminder of everything I'd been denied. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived 3 days after my hospital discharge, and I dressed in clothes Kamala brought me, regular jeans and a loose shirt that didn't squeeze anything. The courthouse felt massive and cold as we walked through security, metal detectors beeping while guards checked bags and waved people through. Elise met us in the hallway outside the courtroom and ran through what would happen, who would speak, where I'd sit. The judge would review evidence packets that included my audio recording, Dr. Ramirez's medical reports, the hospital photos showing my crushed ribcage, and Detective Buckley's documentation of Dad's repeated boundary violations at the hospital. I nodded along, but my hands were shaking, so Kamala had me do the breathing exercises right there in the hallway, slow counts of 4, while people in suits walked past us. Inside the courtroom, Dad sat at a table with his lawyer, wearing a nice shirt, like this was a job interview, instead of a hearing about whether he'd destroyed his daughters. Mom wasn't there because Elise said she'd been interviewed separately, and her testimony was already part of the record. The judge was a woman maybe 50 years old, with gray hair pulled back tight, and she spent 20 minutes reading through the evidence file, while everyone sat in silence. She played my audio recording on the courtroom speakers, and Dad's voice filled the space talking about sacrifice and the 12-inch corset and how I was the last hope for the family legacy. Hearing it played back in that official setting made it sound even more insane than it had felt living through it. The judge's face stayed neutral, but her jaw got tighter as the recording continued. When it finished, she asked Dad's lawyer if he had any statement, and the lawyer said something about cultural practices and family traditions, words that tried to make torture sound respectable. The judge cut him off mid-sentence and said that regardless of cultural context, the medical evidence showed severe physical harm to multiple minors and ongoing danger. She granted temporary custody to the state for both me and Helen, declared us dependent children under CPS protection, and issued a no-contact order prohibiting Dad from any communication or approach within 500 feet of either of us. The order was effective immediately, and violations would result in arrest. Dad's lawyer started to object, but the judge said her ruling was final and court was adjourned. Dad turned in his chair and stared directly at me across the courtroom, his eyes promising that this wasn't really over, that he'd find some way to finish what he started with that ivory corset. The look said I'd betrayed everything that mattered, and he'd make me understand eventually. For 10 years, that stare would have made me fold, made me apologize, made me accept whatever he wanted. But something had shifted when the corset came off, and I stared back without looking away, meeting his eyes, until he was the one who finally turned toward his lawyer. The invisible tether between us stretched thinner, not broken completely, but definitely damaged. Elise touched my shoulder and said we needed to leave through the side exit, where a CPS transport van was waiting. I followed her and Kamala down a hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and out a door that led to the parking lot. The van was white with county logos on the side, and a woman driver nodded at us as we climbed in. The whole ride took maybe 20 minutes through streets I recognized from living here my whole life, except now I was seeing them from the wrong side, the side where you're going to a shelter instead of going home. The domestic violence shelter sat behind a tall fence with cameras pointed at the gate, security designed to keep dangerous people out. Staff met us at the door and walked me through orientation, explaining rules about curfew and chores and mandatory meetings. They showed me the common areas, including a kitchen where residents could cook, a TV room with worn couches, and a little office where advocates worked. My room was on the second floor, small and plain with white walls and a twin bed pushed against the window. The bed was flat, completely horizontal, something I hadn't been able to use in years because the corset made lying down impossible. I'd been sleeping propped up on pillows in a half-sitting position since I was 8. The staff member showing me around pointed out the closet and bathroom and said dinner was at 6 in the dining room downstairs. She left, and I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hand over the flat mattress. The whole situation felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life instead of living my own. I had a drawer for clothes, a lamp on the nightstand, a door that locked from the inside. Everything was basic and institutional, but it was mine, and nobody could walk in whenever they wanted to tighten laces or measure my waist. That first night, I lay flat on my back, staring at the ceiling, and my body kept panicking because the crushing pressure wasn't there. 10 years of constant compression had trained my nervous system to expect that feeling, and the absence triggered its own kind of alarm. My ribs felt too loose. My organs felt like they were floating wrong. My spine didn't know what to do without steel bones forcing it into position. I'd start to drift towards sleep and then jerk awake, gasping because my body thought something was wrong. Around midnight, I gave up on sleeping and sat on the floor doing the breathing exercises Kamala taught me, counting to 4 on the inhale and 4 on the exhale, focusing on the full expansion of my lungs. I did that for maybe 2 hours, until my body finally accepted that the lack of pain was real and safe. Exhaustion won around 3 in the morning, and I passed out on top of the covers, still dressed, too tired to panic anymore. The next few days blurred together in a series of medical appointments that Elise coordinated through CPS. A physical therapist examined how my spine had curved and my ribs had overlapped, taking measurements and photos while explaining that some damage might be permanent, but targeted exercises could help. A gastroenterologist did an endoscopy to see how badly my stomach and intestines were compressed, saying I'd need to relearn how to eat normal portions because my digestive system had shrunk. A pulmonologist tested my lung capacity and found it was about 60% of what it should be for my age and size, but that might improve now that my ribcage could expand. Each specialist developed a care plan with specific goals and timelines, writing everything down in official medical language. I signed releases at every appointment, allowing them to share records with CPS and the court, building this huge file that documented exactly what 10 years of corset training had done to my body. The medical evidence kept stacking up, each report adding another layer of proof that what Dad did wasn't discipline or tradition, it was systematic destruction. Detective Buckley executed a search warrant at the house while I was at my pulmonology appointment. Elise called to tell me about it afterward, saying they'd collected the 12-inch ivory corset, all the locked training devices from my room, and journals dating back generations that documented the family's waist training tradition. The physical evidence got photographed and cataloged at the police station, each piece treated as part of the abuse case. The antique corset that Dad held up like a prize was now sitting in an evidence locker labeled as the weapon it was intended to be. Buckley also found measurement charts Dad kept tracking each daughter's waist circumference over the years, showing the progression from normal childhood measurements to the extreme compression we'd achieved. The documentation was meticulous, almost proud, like Dad thought he was preserving important family records instead of proof of abuse. Elise brought copies of some journal excerpts to show me during our next meeting, and reading them made me understand how deep this pattern went. Great-great-grandmother wrote about enduring the pain as proof of her dedication to beauty and family standards. Great-grandmother described her own daughter's training with pride, noting how quickly she adapted to smaller measurements. Grandmother documented Mom's training and wedding preparation, including detailed notes about achieving 18 inches before the ceremony. The suffering was normalized across generations, each woman writing about it like it was an accomplishment instead of torture. The cycle became so clear in those pages, mothers inflicting on daughters what had been inflicted on them, framing it as love and tradition instead of trauma. My anger expanded beyond just Dad to include all the women who suffered, and then made their daughters suffer too, who could have broken the pattern, but chose to continue it instead. I asked Elise if I could keep copies of some pages, and she said yes, that seeing the full scope might help me process what happened. 6 days after my collapse in the grocery store, Elise got a call that Violetta had agreed to be medically evaluated. Her fiancé broke off the engagement after learning about the abuse investigation, saying he couldn't marry into a family with this kind of scandal. Without the wedding to prepare for, Violetta chose breathing over reputation and checked herself into treatment for her failing liver. The hospital admitted her immediately because her liver enzymes were critically elevated and her skin had turned yellow from jaundice. Elise arranged for an advocate to visit Violetta and explain her options, including safe housing and legal support, planting seeds for longer-term recovery beyond just the immediate medical crisis. I wanted to visit, but Elise said Violetta needed space to make her own choices without family pressure, that the best thing I could do was focus on my own healing and let my sister figure out her path. 2 weeks after the emergency hearing, I had a supervised meeting with Mom at the CPS office. She sat across from me at a conference table with Elise present, crying and saying she blamed herself for not being stronger, for not protecting us. She explained that Dad's own mother raised him with these beliefs, that his grandmother had achieved 16 inches and was celebrated in the family as the standard of beauty. Dad truly thought he was preserving something valuable, carrying on a legacy that made our family special. Mom's voice shook as she described 20 years of living in that house, of having her body crushed and her will broken until she couldn't imagine any other way to exist. I listened without interrupting, and when she finished, I said clearly that I loved her, but I loved being alive more. I told her I would not be coming home, not now, and maybe not ever, and that she needed to choose between protecting her daughters and staying with Dad because she couldn't do both anymore. The boundary felt harsh saying it out loud, but Kamala had helped me practice this conversation, reminding me that setting limits wasn't cruel, it was necessary. Mom nodded and wiped her eyes and said she understood, that she'd start looking into her options for leaving. 3 weeks after my rescue, the school administration reached out through Kamala to discuss accommodations for my eventual return. They wanted to arrange extended deadlines, excused absences for medical appointments, and permission to leave class if I felt overwhelmed. But Kamala warned me that gossip had already spread among students and staff, that people were talking about what happened and speculating about details they didn't actually know. The exposure exhaustion hit me hard as I realized my private trauma was now public knowledge, that I'd be walking into school with everyone knowing some version of my story. I told Kamala I didn't think I could handle that, and she reminded me that visibility also meant safety, that Dad couldn't hurt me in secret anymore because too many people were watching. The publicity that felt awful was also protection, witnesses who would notice if anything seemed wrong. I agreed to start back part-time after another 2 weeks, giving myself space to adjust before facing the public scrutiny that came with being the girl whose dad tried to crush her to death. A few days later, Detective Buckley sat down with Mom in a different room at the CPS office, just the two of them with a recording device on the table between them. Elise told me about it afterwards because I wasn't allowed to be there, said Mom. Talked for almost 2 hours about Dad's family and how he grew up. Turns out Dad's own mother wore corsets her whole life and got down to 16 inches, and his grandmother before her achieved even smaller measurements that the family kept records of like some kind of sick achievement chart. Mom explained that Dad truly believed he was protecting an important tradition, that he saw the waist training as cultural heritage passed down through generations of women in his family line. The way Detective Buckley wrote it up in his report, Dad's motivation came from multi-generational trauma, where each generation taught the next that beauty meant suffering and family pride meant continuing the practice no matter what. It didn't make what he did any less harmful or wrong, but it showed his beliefs weren't just random sadism. They were rooted in this twisted family legacy that had been crushing women for over a century. Detective Buckley documented everything Mom said about Dad's childhood, how his mother praised him for understanding beauty standards, and how his father expected him to find a wife who would maintain the tradition. The complexity got recorded in official reports, creating a fuller picture of why Dad did what he did, even though the harm to me and my sisters stayed exactly the same, regardless of his reasons. 2 weeks after the emergency hearing, Elise called me at the shelter and said the DA wanted to meet about the case direction. We sat in a small conference room at the courthouse, and the DA explained that Dad's lawyer was pushing for a plea deal to lesser charges. The offer would be reduced counts of child endangerment instead of attempted murder, but in exchange, Dad would have to accept a no-contact order that lasted years and agree to jail time plus extended probation with mandatory counseling. Elise walked me through what it meant, speaking slowly, so I understood every part. She said a plea deal gave us certainty of protection because the terms would be locked in and enforceable right away, versus going to trial where outcomes were less predictable and could take months or even years to resolve. The DA might push for harsher charges at trial, but there was also risk that a jury might not fully understand the severity or that legal technicalities could result in lighter consequences. I asked what she thought I should do, and Elise said it wasn't really my choice alone, that the DA would make the final call, but my input mattered, and she wanted me to understand the trade-offs. The guaranteed distance from Dad felt more important than gambling on a trial that might not give us better results, and the combination of jail time and probation meant Dad would face real consequences, even if they weren't the maximum possible. I told the DA I could live with the plea deal if it meant Dad couldn't come near me or my sisters, and Elise squeezed my hand under the table. 3 days later, Helen got released from the hospital to a medical foster home where nurses could keep checking on her healing lung. CPS arranged a supervised visit for me to see her, and I rode there with Elise in her car, feeling my stomach twist into knots. The foster home was this regular house in a suburb with a living room full of medical equipment and a nurse who checked Helen's vitals every few hours. Helen sat on a couch with pillows propped around her, still moving carefully because her ribs hurt, and when she saw me, her face went hard and angry. She started yelling before I even sat down, saying I destroyed everything and broke the family apart and ruined her life by calling for help. Her words came fast and mean, accusing me of being selfish and not understanding that Dad was just trying to help us be beautiful, like the women in our family always were. I didn't defend myself or argue back, just sat in the chair across from her and let her rage pour out while the foster mom and Elise watched from the doorway. Helen said I should have kept quiet and dealt with it like Violetta and Mom did, that now everyone at the school knew our private family business and she could never show her face again. I held space for her feelings without taking on blame for Dad's choices, letting her be angry and hurt without trying to fix it or make her understand right away. After maybe 20 minutes, she ran out of steam and just sat there breathing hard, tears running down her face, and I said quietly that I was sorry she was hurting, but I wasn't sorry for surviving. Before I left the visit, I pulled out a card Kamala had given me with the advocate's contact information printed on it. I set it on the coffee table between us and told Helen I would be here whenever she was ready to talk, that I wasn't going anywhere, and the door was always open when she wanted to reach out. I didn't demand that she forgive me or understand right away, just planted those seeds of connection and left them there for her to pick up if and when she was ready. The foster mom walked me to the door and said Helen was doing okay physically, but struggling emotionally, which made sense given everything she'd been through. On the drive back to the shelter, Kamala called my phone, and Elise put her on speaker. Kamala had heard about the visit from the CPS notes, and she told me that leaving the door open while still maintaining my boundaries showed real growth in understanding healthy relationships. She said a lot of abuse survivors either cut people off completely or let them back in without limits, but I was finding this middle path of staying available without compromising my own safety. The feedback made me feel like maybe I was learning how to do this right, how to protect myself while not giving up on my sister completely. That evening at the shelter, there was a support group meeting in the common room, and I'd been avoiding it for weeks because the idea of talking about what happened made my throat close up. But the shelter coordinator kept encouraging me to try it, saying other survivors found it helpful to share their stories with people who understood. I sat in the circle of folding chairs with maybe 8 other women and girls, ages ranging from teenagers to someone's grandma, and when it was my turn, I forced myself to start talking. I described the corsets and the training and my sister's damaged bodies, speaking in this flat voice that didn't sound like mine. The words came easier than I expected once I started, and nobody interrupted or looked shocked. They just listened and nodded like they'd heard similar things before. After I finished, other women shared their own experiences of different types of abuse, and I started understanding that what happened to me fit this larger pattern of control and harm that showed up in lots of forms. One woman talked about being locked in closets, another about having her food restricted until she was hospitalized, a third about being forced to exercise until she collapsed. The methods were different, but the underlying pattern was the same. Someone with power using that power to hurt and control someone more vulnerable. The solidarity of being believed and understood by people who'd lived through their own trauma made my experience feel survivable instead of isolating. For the first time since this all started, I didn't feel like the only person this had ever happened to. Didn't feel like some kind of freak with a uniquely horrible story. These women got it without me having to explain or justify, and that understanding wrapped around me like the first real safety I'd felt in years. 10 days after the no-contact order got issued, my phone buzzed with texts from Mom's number, but the messages weren't from her. Dad had grabbed her phone, and sent me 3 long texts about family loyalty and tradition, about how I was destroying generations of heritage and breaking sacred bonds that held our family together. He said I was being selfish and ungrateful, that everything he did was for my own good, and someday I'd understand and regret turning against him. I read the messages with shaking hands and immediately took screenshots of everything, then forwarded them to Detective Buckley's email with a note about the date and time. Detective Buckley called me back within an hour and said this was a clear violation of the court order, that Dad wasn't allowed to contact me through any means, including using someone else's phone. The violation got documented as official evidence that Dad couldn't comply with court orders even when his freedom depended on it. Detective Buckley said he'd file a report with the court and the DA, and this would strengthen the case that Dad needed serious consequences because he refused to respect boundaries. I asked if Mom would get in trouble for letting Dad use her phone, and Detective Buckley said probably not, since she likely didn't have much choice, but CPS would need to address it in terms of her ability to protect us. The messages got saved as exhibits in the case file, more proof that Dad saw rules as things that didn't apply to him. A week later, Elise sat down with Mom and me together at the CPS office to talk about what came next. She explained that there was a potential path for Mom to reunify with me and Helen if she was willing to make some major changes. The conditions were clear and specific, not vague promises, but measurable actions. Mom would need to separate from Dad by getting her own housing away from him, attend therapy twice a week to address her role in the abuse, and show consistent compliance with safety planning, including not allowing Dad any access to information about me or my sisters. Elise laid it all out in writing with deadlines and benchmarks, giving Mom a concrete roadmap if she chose to take it. The requirements included Mom getting a job or benefits to support herself, completing a parenting class focused on child safety, and having regular check-ins with CPS to show she was following through. If Mom did all of that and demonstrated over several months that she could prioritize protecting her daughters over staying loyal to Dad, then supervised visits could gradually increase and maybe eventually lead to some kind of relationship. Elise was careful to say this wasn't guaranteed and would depend on Mom's actual choices and behaviors, not just her words or promises. Mom sat there crying and nodding, saying she wanted to try, that she was ready to leave Dad and start over. I didn't fully believe her yet, because words were easy and actions were hard, but I appreciated that CPS was at least giving her a chance to prove herself, instead of just writing her off completely. The next afternoon, Kamala met with Mom at a different office to help her apply for domestic violence housing assistance and benefits. I wasn't there, but Kamala told me about it later, said she walked Mom through pages of paperwork and connected her with resources specifically for women leaving abusive relationships. There were programs that could help with rent deposits, furniture, job training, all the practical stuff that made leaving feel possible instead of impossible. Mom's resistance started softening as she realized that leaving didn't mean being alone or ending up homeless and broke, that there were actual systems designed to support this exact transition. Kamala gave Mom a folder full of information about support groups, legal aid, financial assistance, and counseling services. She explained each resource carefully and helped Mom make a list of next steps with specific phone numbers and deadlines. By the end of the meeting, Mom had applications filled out for 3 different housing programs and appointments scheduled with a therapist and a benefits coordinator. Kamala said Mom seemed overwhelmed, but also kind of hopeful, like maybe she was starting to see a path forward that didn't involve staying trapped with Dad forever. I wanted to believe Mom would follow through, but I also knew that wanting to change and actually changing were 2 different things, so I kept my expectations low and my boundaries firm. A few days after that, I spent a whole afternoon at the police station with Detective Buckley, going through my memories to create a detailed timeline of everything that happened. We sat in a conference room with a big whiteboard, and Detective Buckley wrote dates and events while I talked through 10 years of abuse in chronological order, starting with my 8th birthday and the first corset, then tracking the progression through different devices and tightening sessions, documenting every hospital visit and school incident and family event that showed the escalation. Detective Buckley asked specific questions about dates and locations and who was present, building a clear story that showed how the abuse got worse over time from initial training to life-threatening danger. The process of organizing everything into a timeline gave me this weird sense of control, like I was helping build the case instead of just being a victim. Seeing it all laid out on the whiteboard made the pattern obvious, how Dad kept pushing further and further until my sister's bodies started breaking down and he still didn't stop. Detective Buckley took photos of the timeline and typed everything into a formal report that would be part of the permanent case file. He said having this level of detail would make it much harder for Dad to claim anything was accidental or that he didn't understand the harm he was causing. By the time we finished, my throat was sore from talking and my head hurt from remembering, but the timeline existed now as proof of exactly what happened and when. That same week, the hospital's risk management team held a meeting to review my case and figure out what went wrong with their reporting systems. Elise got a copy of their findings and shared the main points with me. The team identified multiple times when signs of abuse were noted by different staff, but never properly followed up or reported to authorities. The school nurse's documentation of my collapses, the ER visit when I was 13 for dehydration, the orthopedist who saw my curved spine and suspected something was off, all these moments where someone noticed, but the information never got connected into a complete picture. The hospital updated their protocols for recognizing and reporting abuse, creating new requirements for mandatory reporting training and better systems for tracking concerning patterns across multiple visits. They also changed policies about parental interference with medical care, making it harder for parents to prevent doctors from examining kids or talking to them privately. I knew it wasn't my responsibility to fix the medical system, and these changes couldn't undo what happened to me, but knowing that future kids might get identified and helped earlier because of my case provided some bitter validation. Maybe the next girl who showed up with crushed ribs and breathing problems would get rescued before her body was permanently damaged. Maybe some doctor would recognize the pattern faster because they'd been trained on cases like mine. It didn't make my suffering worth it exactly, but at least something useful came out of all this pain, besides just my own survival. The DA's office sent paperwork about the possibility of trial if the plea deal fell through, so I needed to prepare a victim impact statement just in case. Kamala brought over a laptop and a template that outlined what judges want to hear, focusing on facts instead of feelings. I sat at the small desk in my shelter room and typed out everything in plain terms, listing the dates I started training, the medical complications that showed up over the years, the specific injuries to me and my sisters. Writing it all down in numbered points made the pattern obvious in a way that felt powerful, like I was building evidence instead of just crying about what happened. When I finished the draft, Kamala had me practice reading it out loud, but my voice kept shaking, and my hands went numb halfway through. She taught me this technique where I'd pause and name 5 things I could see in the room, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, 1 thing I could taste. The grounding exercise pulled me back from the edge of panic and let me finish reading without completely falling apart. We practiced it over and over until I could get through the whole statement without my vision going spotty or my breathing getting too shallow. Kamala said the goal wasn't to read it without feeling anything, just to stay present enough to get the words out if I needed to testify. Around week 3, the night terrors started hitting me hard, waking up gasping because I'd been dreaming about Dad pulling the laces tighter and tighter while I couldn't move or scream. The worst ones were when I'd dream about the 12-inch ivory corset, feeling it close around me like a trap I couldn't escape, and I'd wake up clawing at my ribs even though the steel was gone. My roommate at the shelter complained to staff about my screaming, so Kamala came over early one morning to teach me more grounding techniques I could use in the middle of the night. She had me practice the 5 senses exercise in bed with my eyes closed, walking through each sense slowly until my heartbeat calmed down. I started keeping a small bag of strong mints on my nightstand because the sharp taste was the fastest way to snap me back to the present when the flashbacks hit. Every night before sleep, I'd run through the grounding steps as practice, training my brain to automatically reach for those tools instead of spiraling into panic. The terrors didn't stop completely, but I learned to manage them faster, cutting the recovery time from an hour down to maybe 15 minutes of focused breathing and sensory awareness. Detective Buckley called to say that Violetta had agreed to sign medical releases and let them photograph her for evidence documentation, which was huge because she'd been refusing all cooperation up until now. Apparently her fiancé had broken off the engagement after learning about the investigation, and without the wedding to prepare for, she decided breathing mattered more than reputation. I got her number from Elise and called her that evening, my hands shaking as I waited for her to pick up. Her voice sounded weak and raspy when she answered, and we both just breathed into the phone for a few seconds before either of us could speak. She told me she was sorry for not protecting me, that she should have done something years ago when she saw what Dad was doing. I told her we were all just trying to survive, that I didn't blame her for being trapped the same way I was. We didn't talk long because she got tired easily, but before hanging up, she said she was glad I got out, and that maybe now she could start healing too. The conversation felt like this small crack opening in the wall between us, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that we'd both been drowning, and neither of us could save the other until we saved ourselves first. A few days later, Elise showed up at the shelter with news that Mom had taken a major step by turning over her house keys and several boxes of old family photos to CPS. The photos documented generations of women in corsets, visual proof of the family tradition Dad had been so obsessed with preserving. Mom had physically separated from Dad by moving into her sister's place, which Elise said was significant because it showed active participation in the investigation rather than just passive acceptance. Elise explained that Mom choosing to hand over evidence and break from Dad meant she was prioritizing her daughters over her marriage, finally making a choice after 20 years of staying silent. The keys meant Mom was giving up access to the house where all the abuse happened, cutting herself off from Dad's control in a concrete way. Elise kept emphasizing how important this moment was because Mom was doing something instead of just letting things happen to her, showing the court she was capable of protecting us if given the chance. 3 weeks after my collapse in the grocery store, the plea hearing finally arrived. Kamala drove me to the courthouse and walked me through security, staying close as we found seats in the courtroom. Dad sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his lawyer beside him shuffling papers. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including my audio recording, the medical reports showing the damage to all three of us, and the documentation of Dad's attempts to violate the protective order. Dad's lawyer stood up and entered a guilty plea to felony child endangerment and assault charges, his voice flat and professional. The judge asked Dad directly if he understood what he was pleading guilty to, and if anyone had forced or threatened him to take the plea. Dad said yes in this tight voice, his jaw clenched, like the words were being pulled out of him against his will. The sentencing came next, 18 months in county jail followed by 5 years of probation with mandatory counseling. The judge also issued a permanent no-contact order that would prevent Dad from any communication with me, Helen, or Violetta without explicit court approval. Dad stared straight ahead during the whole thing, not looking at anyone, his hands folded on the table in front of him. When the judge dismissed the court, Dad finally turned and looked directly at me, and I forced myself to hold his gaze without flinching or looking away. After we left the courtroom, I sat in Kamala's car, feeling this weird mix of relief and frustration churning in my stomach. Elise met us in the parking lot and explained that while 18 months wasn't the maximum sentence the DA could have pushed for, it guaranteed enforceable distance and created a criminal record that would follow Dad forever. I told Elise it felt wrong that decades of suffering only resulted in a year and a half behind bars, that the math didn't add up. She reminded me that imperfect justice is still justice, that the no-contact order and probation terms meant real protection, even if the jail time felt too short. The outcome gave me legal safety, even if it didn't give me the satisfaction of seeing Dad punished proportionally to the harm he caused. What mattered was that he couldn't reach me anymore, couldn't finish what he'd started with that 12-inch corset, couldn't hurt any of us again without immediate consequences. Over the next week, CPS moved forward with placing Helen back with Mom under strict compliance monitoring, with conditions that Mom had to maintain her separate housing and attend all required therapy sessions. A caseworker would be doing regular home visits to make sure Mom was following through and that Helen was safe. Violetta enrolled in an outpatient medical program specifically for liver damage, starting the long process of healing her body while living in transitional housing for young adults. The program included both medical treatment and counseling to help her rebuild her life outside of Dad's control. Elise gave me updates on both my sisters during our weekly check-ins, and hearing that they were getting help eased some of the guilt I'd been carrying about whether my collapse had destroyed the family or saved it. 4 weeks after leaving home, I started attending school part-time with a bunch of accommodations the administration had arranged through Kamala's advocacy. I could turn in assignments late without penalty, skip class for medical appointments without it counting against me, and leave anytime I felt overwhelmed. Walking into the building that first day felt surreal, like I was playing at being a normal teenager when everything about my life was completely abnormal. Teachers who knew what happened gave me these careful looks full of pity, while other students whispered and stared as I walked down the hallways. The routine of homework and lectures provided this weird comfort, giving me something to focus on besides trauma and legal proceedings. But sitting in class taking notes about algebra or history felt disconnected from reality, like I was watching someone else live a regular life while I was still processing everything that had happened. Rumors had spread through school about my disappearance and the investigation, and people kept approaching me with invasive questions disguised as concern. Kids I barely knew would ask what happened or why I'd been gone, acting like they deserved details about my private trauma. I worked with Kamala to develop a simple script I could use to shut down the questions without being rude. I'd tell people it was a private family matter being handled through appropriate channels, then redirect the conversation to something else like homework or weekend plans. Teachers were sometimes worse than students, pulling me aside after class to ask if I was okay or if I needed to talk, their concern feeling more like curiosity than actual support. I practiced setting firm boundaries with everyone, learning to say no to questions I didn't want to answer and walking away from conversations that made me uncomfortable. The boundary setting was exhausting but necessary, protecting my energy for actual healing instead of performing my trauma for people who just wanted the story. Physical therapy sessions twice a week were painful in a different way, stretching and strengthening exercises that targeted the damage from years of compression. The therapist measured my ribcage expansion and spinal flexibility at each session, tracking small improvements that added up over time. My ribs were slowly starting to reshape as the pressure was removed, creating more space for my lungs and organs. My spine was responding to targeted exercises that worked to correct the unnatural curve that had developed. Some days the progress felt impossible to see, just pain and effort without visible results. But the therapist kept showing me the measurements proving that my body was healing, that the changes were real, even when I couldn't feel them yet. Then one day, about 6 weeks into treatment, I took a full deep breath during an exercise and realized there was no restriction, no crushing pressure stopping my lungs from filling completely. I started crying right there in the PT's office because I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without fighting for every bit of air. The therapist let me sit there and just breathe for a few minutes, taking these huge gulps of oxygen that my body had been denied for 10 years. That one full breath felt like proof that my body could recover, that I wasn't permanently broken, that freedom from the corset meant freedom to heal. 6 weeks after the plea hearing, Mom signed the paperwork for a domestic violence housing unit across town, and CPS scheduled the first supervised visit at their office. I sat in a conference room with Helen while a caseworker positioned herself near the door with a clipboard, and Mom arrived 10 minutes late looking thinner than I remembered. She sat across the table from us and folded her hands in that familiar way, except her waist wasn't crushed anymore, and she could actually breathe while sitting. The visit lasted 45 minutes of careful conversation where we talked about school and the weather and Helen's physical therapy appointments, avoiding any mention of Dad or the trial or what happened in that study. The caseworker interrupted twice to redirect when Mom started asking questions about whether we missed home, reminding her that certain topics were off limits per the reunification plan. Mom nodded and switched to asking about my medical appointments instead, and I gave short answers about the gastroenterologist and the orthopedist without sharing details that felt too personal. Helen barely spoke during that first visit, just sat there picking at her fingernails and giving one-word responses when Mom asked direct questions. When the 45 minutes ended, the caseworker stood up and explained that the next visit would be scheduled in 2 weeks if Mom maintained compliance with all the requirements, including her own therapy sessions and housing stability. Mom hugged us both carefully at the door, and I felt how different her body was without the corset, how she could actually bend forward a little bit, how her ribs weren't pressing into me like steel bars. The third supervised visit happened on a Tuesday afternoon, and Helen showed up looking like she'd been crying. She sat down next to me instead of across the table and said her therapist helped her understand some things she needed to say. The caseworker adjusted her position to give us a bit more space while still maintaining supervision, and Helen turned to face me directly. She said she was sorry for blaming me and calling me a family destroyer, that her therapist explained how I didn't break anything that wasn't already broken by what Dad did to all of us. Her voice cracked on the word, sorry, but she kept going, saying she was angry at the wrong person, and she knew that now even though it was hard to admit. I told her I understood being angry and that I didn't expect us to be close right away, that we could just try to keep showing up to these visits and therapy and see what happened. Helen nodded and wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and we agreed to continue family therapy together without making promises about becoming best friends or having some perfect sister relationship. The caseworker made notes on her clipboard and asked if we wanted to talk about anything else, but we both just shook our heads. Mom arrived late again, and the caseworker had to document the tardiness as a compliance issue, explaining that showing up on time was one of the basic requirements for reunification. The rest of the visit was less tense with Helen not glaring at me, and we even talked a little bit about a show we both watched. Violetta called me on a Thursday night while I was doing homework at the shelter. She said her liver function tests came back better than the doctors expected, and they were talking about her maybe not needing a transplant if she continued improving. Her voice sounded stronger than the last time we talked, less like she was drowning in her own body. She told me she canceled the wedding completely, not rescheduled it, just ended the whole thing because she realized she didn't even know who she was without trying to achieve some waist measurement. Her ex-fiancé had already moved on anyway, which she said was fine because she needed to figure out what she actually wanted instead of just following the script Dad wrote for her life. I asked how she was doing with the not wearing a corset thing, and she laughed, this surprised sound like she forgot she could laugh freely. She said learning to just breathe and take up space without apologizing was harder than she expected, that she kept catching herself trying to make herself smaller in rooms or when walking past people, but her therapist was helping her practice just existing at her normal size without that constant pressure to shrink down. She told me she was proud of me for getting us all out, for being brave enough to collapse in that grocery store and start the whole intervention process. I didn't feel particularly brave, just desperate, but I thanked her anyway. We talked for almost an hour about nothing important, just sister stuff about TV shows and what foods she could finally eat, now that her stomach wasn't crushed flat. Before hanging up, she said this was the first time in her life she was just breathing, without it being a fight, and that freedom was worth more than any wedding dress or family legacy. 8 weeks after my collapse, Detective Buckley called and asked if I could come to the police station to pick up copies of my statement and the evidence photos. Kamala drove me there on a Saturday morning, and we met him in a small office where he had everything organized in a large envelope. He explained that the criminal case was complete now with Dad's guilty plea, and the original evidence would stay in police custody, but I could have copies for my own records if I wanted them. I took the envelope and held it in my lap, feeling the weight of all those documents and photos that proved what happened. Detective Buckley said the case file was moving to archive, which meant it would be stored securely, but wouldn't be actively worked anymore since the prosecution was finished. He shook my hand and told me I did a brave thing by speaking up and following through with the investigation, that a lot of victims don't make it this far in the process. The meeting felt like an ending, even though I knew the actual effects of what happened would keep going for years. Kamala and I sat in her car in the parking lot afterward, and I stared at the envelope, not sure if I wanted to open it and look at the evidence photos or just keep it sealed. She said I didn't have to decide right now, that I could put it away and look at it later if I ever needed proof or wanted to remember exactly what happened. I tucked the envelope into my backpack, and we drove back to the shelter without talking much, just listening to the radio and letting the closure settle in. The CPS caseworker arranged for me to return to the house one time to collect my essential belongings, and she drove me there on a Wednesday afternoon when she knew Dad was at work and Mom was at her housing unit. We pulled up to the house and it looked smaller than I remembered, less powerful somehow now that I wasn't trapped inside it. The caseworker unlocked the door with keys Mom had turned over, and we walked through rooms that felt like they belonged to a different life. My bedroom looked exactly the same, bed made tight with the pink comforter I'd had since I was 12, desk organized with school supplies, closet full of clothes that mostly didn't fit anymore because my body had changed so much without the corset. I grabbed my laptop and charger first, then started pulling clothes off hangers and stuffing them into garbage bags the caseworker had brought. I took my books from the shelf, my photos from the bulletin board, the stuffed bear Mom gave me when I was little. The caseworker asked if I wanted to go into Dad's study to get anything, and I said absolutely not, that there was nothing in that room I ever wanted to see again. We loaded everything into her car in 3 trips, and I walked through the house one last time, looking at the kitchen where we'd eaten those silent dinners, the living room where Violetta used to sit dying on the couch, the bathroom where I'd locked myself in to plan my grocery store collapse. I walked out the front door and didn't look back, leaving behind the study and the training equipment and all the years of suffering that happened inside those walls. The caseworker locked the door and returned the keys to her pocket, and we drove away while I watched the house get smaller in the side mirror until we turned the corner and it disappeared. The court scheduled a hearing to finalize the long-term restraining orders, and I didn't have to attend because the DA handled everything without needing my testimony. Kamala called me afterward to explain that the judge approved protective orders extending for 10 years, renewable if needed when they expired. Dad couldn't contact me or Helen or Violetta, couldn't come within 500 feet of any of us, couldn't try to reach us through third parties or social media or any other method. The orders were enforceable across state lines if any of us moved, and violations would result in immediate arrest and additional criminal charges. Dad had started his mandated treatment program while serving his jail sentence, meeting with a psychologist twice a week to address whatever beliefs made him think crushing his daughter's bodies was acceptable. The legal protections felt solid and real, not just words on paper but actual boundaries with consequences attached. Kamala explained that when Dad eventually got released from jail, he'd still have 5 years of probation with strict conditions, and any violation of the restraining orders or probation terms would send him back to jail immediately. I asked what would happen if he tried to contact us anyway, and she said the orders gave law enforcement clear authority to act, that I could call 911 if he showed up, and police would have to respond and arrest him. The distance between us wasn't just physical space anymore, but legal force, and knowing that made me feel safer than I had in years. I bought a cheap notebook at the dollar store and started keeping a journal to track both my trauma triggers and my small wins. The first entry documented a panic attack I had when someone bumped into me in the hallway at the school, and I felt that old crushing pressure for a split second before realizing it wasn't real. I wrote down what triggered it, how long it lasted, what helped me calm down, trying to find patterns in when the flashbacks hit hardest. But I also wrote about the small victories, like the day I wore a loose t-shirt to the school without feeling exposed or wrong, or when I ate a full meal without my stomach hurting, because there was actually room for food now. The journal became this private record of healing that belonged only to me, not to CPS or doctors or lawyers, but just my own documentation of getting better. I wrote about physical therapy progress, about visits with Mom and Helen, about conversations with Violetta, about days when I felt normal, and days when the trauma was so heavy I could barely function. Some entries were just lists of things that happened, and other entries were longer processing of feelings I didn't know how to talk about out loud. I kept the journal hidden in my shelter room under my mattress because it contained thoughts too raw to share with anyone, words about hating Dad and missing him at the same time, about loving Mom and being angry at her for not protecting us, about grief for the childhood I never got to have. Writing it all down made the experiences feel more real and manageable, like I was taking control of my own story instead of just living through events that happened to me. Family therapy sessions with Mom happened every other week in a small office with a therapist who specialized in abuse cases. During the 5th session, Mom finally said out loud that she was complicit in what happened and that fear kept her silent for 20 years. She talked about being terrified of Dad, of having no money or job skills, of believing she deserved the suffering because that's what she'd been taught since her own training started at 16. The therapist asked what she wished she'd done differently, and Mom started crying, saying she wished she'd been brave enough to leave the first time Dad laced a corset on Violetta. I sat there listening and feeling this complicated mix of anger and sadness, understanding her fear, but also knowing that understanding didn't erase the damage. When the therapist asked me to respond, I said clearly that I loved Mom, but I needed her to know that any relationship we had going forward depended on her consistent choices to prioritize safety over loyalty to Dad. We established concrete boundaries about what would happen if Mom wavered, if she tried to excuse Dad's behavior, or suggest reconciliation, or minimize what happened. The therapist wrote everything down and created a formal agreement that Mom had to maintain her separation from Dad, continue her own therapy, show up on time to supervised visits, and never ask us to forgive him or maintain contact with him. Mom signed the agreement and promised she would follow through, that she was choosing us this time, even though it meant losing the life she'd known for decades. I didn't promise to trust her immediately, or to move back in with her, just said I'd keep showing up to therapy and visits, and we'd see where it went, based on her actions, not her words. 3 months after the grocery store collapse, Detective Buckley contacted me about the ivory corset and asked what I wanted done with it, now that the criminal case was finished. He explained that technically, it could be returned to the family as property, but given its significance as evidence of the abuse, he wanted to know my preference. I thought about that 12-inch torture device sitting in an evidence locker, about how it represented 5 generations of women being crushed into impossible shapes. The idea of it going back to the family as some kind of heirloom made me feel sick, like it would just be waiting to destroy another generation of daughters. I told Detective Buckley I wanted to authorize it to be kept permanently as evidence for law enforcement training and advocacy purposes, to be used in teaching other officers and social workers how to recognize this kind of abuse. He said that was possible, and he'd arrange for it to be transferred to a training program where it could help protect other kids. Reframing the object from symbol of family tradition to educational tool felt like taking power away from what it originally meant, turning Dad's weapon into something that would prevent future suffering instead of causing it. I signed the authorization paperwork and felt lighter somehow, knowing that corset would never touch another person's body, but would instead serve as proof that this kind of abuse happens and needs to be stopped. Detective Buckley thanked me and said my decision would help a lot of people, that sometimes the best thing survivors can do is make sure their evidence helps others avoid the same harm. That night in my shelter room, I practiced the slow breathing exercises that had become my evening routine before bed. I lay flat on my back on the narrow mattress and put one hand on my stomach, feeling it rise and fall without any restriction or crushing pressure. I could take these huge, deep breaths that filled my lungs completely, feeling my ribcage expand in all directions instead of being forced into an unnatural shape. The absence of pain had become its own kind of promise that my body belonged to me again, that I got to decide how much space I took up and how deeply I breathed. I bent over and touched my toes, something I hadn't been able to do in 10 years. I twisted to look behind me at the wall, rotating my spine freely without steel bones preventing the movement. I lay on my side and curled into a ball, feeling my body fold naturally instead of being held rigid by locked metal. All these simple movements that most people never think about felt like miracles, like proof that freedom from the corset meant freedom to exist in my body without constantly fighting it. The breathing exercises had become meditation, a way to remind myself every night that I survived and my body was healing, and I had a future that I got to choose. I fell asleep, breathing slowly and deeply, my lungs filling completely with air, my ribs expanding naturally, my body finally mine. The next morning, I woke up without pain pressing into my ribs and spent 5 minutes just stretching in bed, bending and twisting in ways I couldn't do for 10 years. School started 2 weeks later with half days at first, and I sat through algebra and English lit without needing to leave class to catch my breath. My locker was on the second floor, and I climbed those stairs without stopping, without the gray spots swimming across my vision that used to hit me halfway up. The kids who knew what happened mostly left me alone, and the ones who didn't just thought I'd been sick for a while. I met with the school counselor every Tuesday to check in, and she helped me figure out which assignments I could handle and which ones needed extensions. Medical appointments filled up Thursdays with the lung doctor checking my breathing capacity and the stomach doctor monitoring how my digestive system was adjusting to actually having space to work. The physical therapist had me doing exercises to straighten my spine and strengthen the muscles that had been squeezed useless for years, and every week I could bend a little further and stand a little straighter. Family therapy happened on Saturdays at the CPS office with me and Helen sitting across from each other, while the therapist asked us questions about trust and hurt and what we needed to feel safe. Helen showed up every week and actually talked instead of just sitting there angry, and by the second month, she admitted she was glad I collapsed in that store, even though it felt like betrayal at the time. Mom came to separate sessions where she practiced saying out loud that she should have protected us, that fear wasn't an excuse for letting Dad destroy our bodies. She got her own apartment and kept it clean and showed up on time to every single visit, proving through boring, consistent actions that she meant what she said about choosing us over him. Violetta focused on her liver treatment and called me once a week to report that she could take deeper breaths now and her skin wasn't yellow anymore. Support group met Wednesday nights, and I listened to other survivors talk about their different kinds of abuse, realizing that control came in lots of forms, but freedom felt the same for all of us. 4 months after Dad held up that 12-inch corset, I sat in my shelter room and took the deepest breath my lungs had ever held, feeling my ribs expand fully without any steel bones stopping them. I wasn't magically healed and probably never would be completely, but I could breathe and move and eat without puking, and that was enough. The grocery store collapse broke the chain that had been crushing our family's women for 5 generations, and now me and my sisters got to figure out who we were when beauty didn't require suffering. We all carried scars on our bodies and probably always would, but we were safer now, and learning that taking up space wasn't something to apologize for. That's my side of the story, but I already know half of you see it completely differently. And honestly, that's what makes this fun. Leave your version in the comments. I'll be checking through them later. You always bring something new.